Well, it's 12 o'clock here in the city of stories, our wonderful city of Norwich. Little wet and cold today. Thank you very much for joining us for this last interdisciplinary Japanese studies webinar organised by the Centre for Japanese Studies at the University of East Anglia and the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures. My name is Simon Kaner. I'm the director of the Centre for Japanese Studies here, and it's wonderful to welcome you all and to also welcome our speakers today, who are going to tackle the topic that I know is of great significance to most of us working in Japan from a distance, and that is the topic of translation, how to most effectively translate Japanese texts into English or indeed into other languages. I'm particularly pleased today that we've got specialists not only in translation of academic texts and people who are working on the translation of academic texts, but we've also got specialists in literary translation, which is a particular strength of ours at the University of East Anglia. And I'm delighted that we have colleagues from the British Centre for Literary Translation here who are going to be giving us some thoughts a little bit later on in the course of the hour. We've got plenty of time for questions and answers after each of the short presentations that we're going to move into now. Please do use the Q&A function or the chat function that you can see on the bottom of your screen. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Oliver Moxham, who's going to introduce the individual speakers, and Ollie will also moderate the Q&A session for us. And then I'll come back at the end of the session with a few comments just to wrap up. But thank you very much indeed, as I say, for joining us, and I very much hope you enjoy the webinar. Thank you, Ollie.
Thank you, Simon. First up, we have Joseph Ryan, Assistant Professor at Okayama University. He's an archaeologist with a focus on metal artifacts of the Yayoi and Kofun periods. Over to you, Joseph.
Thank you, Ollie. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
All right, wonderful. All right, so my name is Joseph Ryan. I'm assistant professor at Okayama University in Japan. I'm an archaeologist, and as Ollie said, my focus is on the metal artifacts of the Yayoi and Kofun periods. First off, thank you for allowing me to be a part of today's event. It truly is an honor to spend this time with you all. A brief introduction: between my undergraduate and my master's, I worked for around 2 years as a freelance translator, but most of my work was related to business or finance, company white papers, websites for municipalities or prefectures. But I always felt most fulfilled when the rare history or culture related piece happened to come my way. So starting when I entered my master's program and continuing through PhD and postdoc and into the present day, increasingly specialized understanding of a specific field, in my case, archaeology and anthropology, allowed me to more or less completely shift into translating and editing work related to that field. Of course, in addition to my day job. And a talk on academic translation can truly go in a myriad of directions. So when I heard that most listeners were most likely going to be master's students, I thought that I would draw on my daily experience to tailor what I say to perhaps where I was at that stage in my development. In other words, perhaps what I needed to hear at that time. So to begin, within academic translation, accuracy, needless to say, is of utmost importance. And I think that this can be brought about through two vehicles mainly. The first being faithfulness to the original specialized content, and the second being grammatical, syntactical, and stylistic accuracy that clearly expresses this content. So a translator needs specialized knowledge to satisfy the first requirement of faithfulness. And of course, this isn't always possible or practical when something is too far outside of our area of expertise and we don't feel that we can responsibly carry out the translation. The best course of action, needless to say, is to turn down the request, which sometimes is your wallet might disagree with you, but it's the most responsible decision. But if you do end up accepting the job, you'll need to quickly pick up the basics of a field or supplement what understanding you already have through preliminary research. So reading introductory text on the fly, perhaps. And this is done nowadays relatively easily by, in addition to going to your local library, which still exists, checking out relevant works in Google Books, Google Scholar, academia.edu, the preview function of Amazon, etc. And not only does this supplement our understanding, it allows us to do another important task, and that is when bringing a local text to a global audience, you need to clarify or expand on certain parts. And this is obviously difficult to do, or perhaps irresponsible to do if you don't have quite a firm enough grasp on the original material. In relation to that, when in doubt, ask. If they are alive and have email, I always try to keep an open channel with the original author. And this has always yielded fruitful results and has indeed led to many wonderful friendships. So I always recommend keeping an open channel with the original author. The second vehicle involves a fine-tuned understanding of and control over both Japanese and English grammar. And while tedious, ensuring you have a strong grasp on Japanese and English is a basic requirement. While this is probably obvious for Japanese, assuming it's our second language, we cannot assume that just because we are native speakers of English, that we can produce publishable copy just by the nature of being a native speaker. So honing that skill is extremely important. On the other hand, there's no lack of beautiful, terribly inaccurate translations out there. And not only do these beautiful, inaccurate translations not advance our collective understanding of the field, but through their inaccuracy, they actually hinder it. So we need a balance there. Another point I would like to stress is being a stickler for details, and even those that don't seem important on first glance. To give a fairly recent example from maybe a month or two ago, I was editing a text, an English text, that a Japanese author had translated himself. And when editing a text that has been translated into someone's second language, contact with the author becomes all the more important, as I'm sure you can imagine. In this example, there was some social change mentioned as having developed from the 15th century. And from context, not simply translating the words as simple words on the page, but as actual content that needed to be expressed. From the context, I felt that I should ask the author whether this should be from the 15th century or by the 15th century. Additionally, does it include the 15th century or not? And as a result, not only did this allow me to accurately edit the text, it became clear that this phrasing was being used in several different ways throughout the text, and that needed to be addressed. Next, I would like to briefly touch upon terminology and register. And a Japanese term, as needless to say, can be translated in multiple ways depending on your field. And so you need to think about what the preferred way of expressing that term is in your specific English field. And if you don't know offhand, brushing up with the text, as I mentioned earlier, is highly instructive. Now, register, or the words you choose and the way you piece them together to write your sentences, is a significant issue that should be acknowledged or addressed. From my experience, I often come up against this issue when editing others' texts. So Japanese is often characterized by ambiguity, and to a certain extent, I think that holds true, but the problem in our situation arises when translations are too direct with this ambiguity. For example, even though the original author is basing his or her statements on years of high quality empirical research, and the target audience would understand it as so, a problematic or too direct translation renders his or her statements as uncertain or speculative. So problem translations are often filled with such phrases as, it may be thought that this might be the case. They're couched in that kind of language. And I see this quite a bit. And I believe it derives from translating the words on the page simply as words that need to be relocated into a new language, rather than as translating the content that they express. And not only is this not a very good translation, it actually does a disservice to that researcher. And indeed, it may inhibit them, him or her, from their deserved recognition in the English-speaking academic world. Because, who wants to trust research that sounds unsure and wishy-washy, which, it should be stretched, the original most often did not sound that way. So we need to ask ourselves, in my opinion, is this the appropriate register for the medium at hand? What wording for this medium, say a book chapter or a journal article, is natural and appropriate, and how would an English native speaker phrase it if they were writing a comparable piece? So just to kind of wrap up these meandering thoughts, my normal order of operations for translation based on what experience I have accumulated through the years is, first, I read the Japanese text through and through. I then translate the text to English, contacting the author and checking English language sources as may be. I then conduct a line-by-line comparison of the Japanese and English. And while tedious, this is extremely important and many mistakes are found at this stage. And then lastly, I treat the English text as an English text, an independent English text, not as a translation, and I polish and rework as necessary. So it looks like I'm about out of time, so I'll stop here and pass it along to our next speaker. I want to thank everyone for your kind attention, and I look forward to the continuing discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Next, we have Oscar Wren. Oscar is a research student at the University of Kobe, looking at depopulation and agrarian change in rural areas. He is also an academic associate of the Sainsbury Institute. Over to you, Oscar. Oscar, are you with us? It seems you might be having some technical difficulties reaching Oscar at the moment. We'll catch him next if he's still with us. For the meantime, I might suggest that we move on to Christopher Hayes. Chris is a researcher specializing in British media depictions of Japan and issues of Orientalism. He is also interested in how Orientalist discourses about Japan are used within Japan to promote the country globally through tourism and initiatives such as Cool Japan. Christopher, over to you.
Thank you, Ollie. So yes, hello everyone. I'm a research associate at the Sainsbury Institute of Japanese Arts and Cultures. As Ollie kindly said in his introduction, as a researcher, I focus on foreign perceptions and representations of Japan, Japanese self-representations, and issues of Orientalism and stereotyping. But at the Sainsbury Institute, I'm involved in a number of different and diverse projects. Now, I should say I'm not a professional translator, and I never have been, but translation is an essential skill for anyone engaged in academic research of a non-English speaking country. As a researcher of Japan, it's imperative that I use Japanese language sources. So this is a bit of background. My PhD research looked at British media discourses about Japan, and so you could argue I cheated a little bit. I analysed English language texts about Japan, and I interviewed English-speaking journalists. Nonetheless, even for this PhD research, I did extensive reading of Japanese language materials, because it would be arrogant to think that all research is written in English and that Japanese themselves hadn't undertaken research on the representation of Japan abroad. I also carried out interviews in Japanese because those Japanese voices were vital to my research. As I was dealing with issues of representation, to admit Japanese voices would make me no better than the news and media material I was analysing. It also enriched my research, providing a more diverse range of viewpoints. Engaging with Japanese language materials and conducting interviews in Japanese early on has also put me in good stead for my postdoctoral career. In September last year, I went out to Japan for a short-term fellowship to conduct research on tourist perceptions of Japan, focusing on tourists who were in the country for the Rugby World Cup. While again, I was doing a lot of interviews with English speakers, I was also interested in tourism in Japan more generally, and a lot of this material is in the Japanese language, be it statistics, government strategy, or academic research. This meant that when I was writing up my findings for lectures, papers, and so on, I needed to translate parts of this Japanese research. And so I'm having to make these translation decisions of whether to provide a full translation or to paraphrase. In either case, I have to deal with issues of nuance or terms that do not easily translate. And a lot of the things that Joseph was saying very much apply to what I'm doing, even if it's not a translation project per se. In the course of doing my academic research, I necessarily have to translate and follow these same principles and rules. And while sometimes a struggle, doing this has meant that I've developed skills that I can apply outside of my own research. So at the Sainsbury Institute, I've put my Japanese knowledge and translation skills into practice, undertaking a full translation of a Japanese language monograph. Possibly the greatest challenge for me when undertaking this translation is not having been trained in the field in Japanese, in the Japanese language. So even if I understand the concepts in the field in English, I may not know the terms in Japanese, or different terms and different theoretical approaches may be more prominent and may exist in Japan, making alignments with English language academia on the subject difficult. And this is something that Joseph has already picked up on. A great deal of my time has been spent familiarizing myself with disciplines in Japanese. Joseph also made a very good point about communication. Being able to field questions to the original author helps when you reach a wall in your translation, when you reach something that you just don't quite understand and don't know how to render in English. And initially, you might feel embarrassed about having to do it and feel that it may lower the original author's view of you as a translator. But it's simply not the case, and it actually results in a more accurate and more satisfying translation. And another very good point that Joseph made is that a text is not complete once you've been through it and done that initial translation. It's a process with so many steps, going back over the text and reworking it. And once you have this English language text, reworking that as an English language text to make it sound natural, to make it suitable for an academic audience in the English language. And it is challenging, but also rewarding. And these skills are going to be essential to me throughout an academic career, but even for those who may decide to leave academia, these skills are going to be so useful to you in so many different settings, be that business translation, as Joseph said, he was doing that freelance for a number of years, or any other kind of setting that might require those kinds of translation skills. I know that I have been speaking for a little bit now, so I'll probably cut it short there. And I know Oscar's back now, so he can take over, and then I can come back for the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Over to us. Oscar, are you there? Seems we're still having some slight technical issues. We'll have to move on to the next speaker, and hopefully Oscar can rejoin us in a moment. So for now, I'll move on to our lecturers at UEA on translation. So starting off with Cecilia is in translation at the University of East Anglia, where she convenes with the MA in Literary Translation and works for BCLT as postgraduate and professional liaison. Over to you, Cecilia.
Thank you, Oliver, and thank
Cecilia.
you for having me at this seminar today. Well, obviously, because of my research interest, I'm not going to focus on Japanese translation, but I am going to take some of the points that were actually mentioned and discussed about translation. My research focuses on the translation of poetry, a special focus on the process of translation and the disciplinary boundaries between literary translation and creative writing. Is there a boundary? Does the boundary not disappear when we think of literary translation as a creative writing practice? At UEA, I also convened the MA in Literary Translation, which is the longest running MA focused exclusively on literary translation in the UK. So going back to the translation of poetry, at the moment I'm actually revising translations of prose poetry for new directions. I've got to submit the manuscript tomorrow, so wish me luck. And one of the things I've been doing for the last few days is read my translations out loud. And I am very much prompted by the text In Action by Cecily Berry, which is actually a book aimed at actors and students of acting, of drama students. And what I'm doing at the moment with my revisions is read out the words. I'm pausing on every morpheme. I'm very much attentive to the muscularity of language, as Barry says. I want the power of words to resonate in my translation, especially because poetic prose, or the prose poem, is like poetry, a very concentrated form. The poet is working within that constraint of trying to cram in as much as possible into the language of the text. And as a translator, I have to respond to this constraint. I have to also try and concentrate meaning and form. What do I do? What is my process? I always start with a literal translation, although I have to say that I agree with Peter Bush, former director of the British Centre for Literary Translation, who used to say that a literal translation is always a first stab at translation. You are already moving away and putting forward a version, a reading of the source text. However, a starting point, such as a literal translation, is a useful starting point. And from then on comes a tireless process of editing. And some of the things that were said already today resonate with me. We are attentive to the source text as translators. I want to shy away from the term faithfulness or fidelity, and I will say why. But you are looking, you are comparing continually in that redrafting process, comparing the text that you are producing against the source text. So two thoughts about poetry translation, which are going to be relevant for whoever embarks on translation, whether it's from Japanese into English, from English into Japanese, any language combination. The first one is the untranslatability, apparently, of poetry. I would argue against this, and I want to quote this wonderful book by Mireille Gansel, Translation as Transhumans, who says that her conviction very early on, when she discovered languages and how you could cross between one language to another, no word that speaks of what is human is untranslatable. And I think that poetry speaks to our shared humanity, so you can translate poetry. Sometimes the difficulty is not that you don't understand the source text, you understand what is happening, but the untranslatability happens when you have to search long and hard for a way to articulate the same concept, the same idea in your target language. So that's Mireille Gansel, as I said, in the wonderful translation by Ross Sparks. So untranslatability, I would argue against that. And I would also argue against the idea of fidelity. And I would like to propose the concept of intimacy, joining Sophie Collins, the translator of this Dutch poet, Lieke Marsman. And in her translator's note at the end of this volume, what Sophie Collins does is very, very clever. She produces a translator's note in the form of letters to the poet she has just translated. And she says that she proposes intimacy as a new ideal in translation. Intimacy began with an observation that while fidelity implies the presence of a primary source of power, intimacy indicates a mutual, consensual, and willing exchange between two or more subjects without referencing an authority at all. And so intimacy is about developing a sincere engagement with the source text. Sincere engagement with the source text. I like that. Author, and also the culture, about getting close. Now, I have been translating this Argentine poet, Alejandra Pizarnik, from the years of my PhD onwards. And now I'm engaged in translating her short prose text. And I can talk about this process of engagement, total engagement with the work of the writer, with her poetics, as it were. Where did these texts come from? And that sincere engagement is basic in the understanding of intimacy as a new ideal in translation to replace fidelity. And I think I'm going to leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. Next up, we have Duncan Large. I'll just want to see if Oscar has hand. Oscar, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear or see me?
Fantastic. We can definitely hear you. Not see you so far, but hearing
Oh, and I think you might have me there.
Hearing is a great step forwards. Duncan, if there's anything, Oscar will come to you. Oscar, over to you.
Thank you, and apologies for the technical issues this end. I'm not sure I have a huge amount to sort of add to what's been said already. My experience with academic translation is certainly limited compared to Joseph and others here. Limited to the work that I've done for CJS for the Sainsbury Institute. Most recently, a series of papers for the Oxford Handbook of the Archaeology of Korea and Japan, dealing with the Jomon and Yayoi archaeology. That was part of work for the Centre for Archaeology and Heritage at the Sainsbury Institute. Having not done huge amounts of academic translation, I thought I'd just talk about a few of the things that I noticed whilst working on papers, archaeology papers. A lot of the points sort of overlap with what Joseph was talking about, and Chris as well, I think, although I didn't catch all of what he was saying. First, it's not something that I've got noted down here, but when Joseph was talking about reading a translation which looked as though it had been too focused on the literal words that were being translated, it reminded me of a certain feeling that I got when I've been working through these papers for a while, of a necessity of both focusing on the literal, on the words on the page, on the facts that you were trying to translate, whilst also simultaneously having to sort of take a broad view at the same time, and how you sort of get into the zone where you're both at a fine level and at a broad level, taking in the sort of the flow of the narrative. And it wasn't always easy to sort of enter into that state, and sometimes the temptation is just to go back down to the translation of individual words or sentences, because that's an easy thing to do, but it's how to sort of maintain that balance. So that was one thing that occurred to me. Secondly, just generally about knowledge, my background is in anthropology and also in international development studies. I do know a fair amount about archaeology and Japanese archaeology, but even so, there are still multiple things that I have come across that I do not know a huge amount about. And so, as Joseph was saying, it's how do you gain an effective background, an effective knowledge, so it sounds as though when you're translating it, the final piece comes across as though it's been written by someone who has the knowledge and is transmitting that knowledge in a way that sounds correct, sounds professional, sounds as though it has the knowledge in the background, providing the authenticity so that it is meaningful. You know, when do you need to write additional information for the reader? Where is that information going to come from? A second point that I was thinking about, this came up particularly in the Oxford Handbook that I was translating. I was translating multiple papers which were dealing with similar subjects, using similar terminology and describing similar events or similar details. And this was interesting because although they were describing similar things, they were obviously describing them in Japanese in a different way. And so it was at that moment that I was having to think about the broader stylistic choices that you would have to make to give a sense of a particular writer's style, which was not something that I was thinking about at the beginning of my translation, but certainly by the end of those papers, I was thinking about whether these writers were particularly verbose, whether they were using a variety of different terms, that sort of thing. And the third point, which I don't know whether this is specific to academic translation, but it's certainly something that occurred to me while I was translating academic papers, was to do with positionality. and the way in which, when you're translating for a researcher, you are positioning an argument, their argument, in terms of, for example, when you're looking at literature reviews, in terms of other, or in position against other arguments, other researchers. You're translating their position on a particular issue, and it's not just making sure that their position is properly translated and the nuances within it, but also how they have positioned themselves through their use of language, which can contain any number of degrees of strong argumentation or perhaps more passive argumentation. And there was a particular example in one of the papers that I was dealing with in which someone had quoted another researcher, another scholar who had been talking at a conference and had made a joke, and that joke had revealed something that they had disagreed with. And I was having to think about how that particular person's position was being portrayed against some other researchers, and then of course my own within that as well as a translator. Obviously I'm not completely separate from this process. I don't have any answers. I don't have a background in translation, in terms of, I've not been trained in translation. But it just occurred to me as an interesting point. Anyway, I think I've talked for long enough, so I shall leave that there, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Oscar. And now over to our last speaker, Duncan Large. Thank you. Sorry about the interruption there. Duncan is an academic director of the British Centre for Literary Translation. He is professor of European Clifford E Network on 21 literary translation training institutions. Over to you, Duncan.
Thanks, Oliver, and thanks, Simon and Oliver, for inviting me to be part of this session. I've been having some problems with connectivity, so I hope that doesn't affect my my contribution now. Of course, it's kind of the most thankless task coming on as the last speaker after a wonderful array already of thoughts on this topic. So I'll do my best to say something new. Talking of doing my best, I'm afraid what I have in the background here is my nod to the festive theme. That's about all I could come up with, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. So then, let me perhaps share my screen if I can, because I do have a short presentation, and it's a presentation on the subject of non-fiction translation. I'll come on to that specific theme in a moment. I want to say something initially just about the work of the British Centre for Literary Translation, in particular our work with Japanese colleagues. Then I'll say a bit about my own specialism, and then I want to come on to this more general question about non-fiction translation, which it seemed to me would be the best way that I could contribute to a panel on translating Japanese academia. I'm afraid, like my colleague Ceci, who spoke before, I don't work with Japanese myself. So the British Centre for Literary Translation, this is our homepage, bclt.org.uk. BCLT, as Simon mentioned at the opening, was founded in 1989, so we've just celebrated our 30th anniversary. We promote literary translation from all languages into English, both academically as a research centre within the School of Literature, Drama and Creative Writing at UEA, and also more generally within the profession of literary translation, particularly in collaboration with our partners, the National Centre for Writing. I mentioned that we've worked with many languages over the years, but if we focus specifically on Japanese, then for 7 years we had a partnership with the Nippon Foundation, and that led, among other things, to the Book of Tokyo from 2015, published by Comma Press, and then most recently the Keshiki New Voices from Japan series of chapbooks published by the UEA Publishing Project's Strangers Press imprint. So those are some very concrete results of our long-standing partnership with the Nippon Foundation. We run an annual summer school where we have had Japanese English translation workshops over the years. We've welcomed a number of visiting Japanese scholars to work with us at BCLT, most recently David Karashima and Kyoko Yoshida last summer. We supervise PhD and MA dissertations on Japanese subjects. Most recently, I supervised Motoko Akashi on Japanese celebrity translators. Now then, my own specialism is not a Japanese related, I'm afraid, but it is related to translating philosophy. These are some of my my book-length translations. I've translated from the French and the German, and you'll perhaps see there's a common theme, which is the German philosopher Nietzsche. So I work on translating philosophy. I've also been editing the complete works of Nietzsche into English, and most recently I've begun to co-edit a series with Routledge, Studies in Literary Translation. A final publication to mention, going back to Ceci's point about untranslatability. This is a theme which we've been looking at in BCLT for a number of years. We had a postgraduate symposium on this topic a few years ago, and out of that ultimately came this volume, which was published with Routledge in 2018. And I was one of the co-editors there. Untranslatability is a topic which, as Ceci pointed out, relates to poetry, it relates to philosophy in particular, and my own interest is as a translator of philosophical works. Now, as the academic director of the British Centre for Literary Translation, I am, of course, led to ponder the question of where philosophy translation fits in the overall context of literary translation. Because if you ask people what they understand by literary translation, then they'll probably mention poetry or prose fiction or drama translation. But there's a very sizable grey area between that and, let's say, translating Microsoft manuals. And that's the area that we're really interested in focusing on today, as I understand it. So it's a grey area which would include, yes, academic translation, but also essays, historical writing, philosophy, life and travel writing, everything from through to popular science, social science, politics and current affairs. So I've been interested in recent years in exploring the extent to which the translation of these genres, of these forms, might be usefully described as literary translation. So let's think of some initial considerations here. There's a distinction which a prominent translation theorist of today, Lawrence Venuti, made in one of our events a couple of years ago, when he questioned how exactly we wanted to define literary translation, and he distinguished between what he called belletristic and humanistic literary translation. So belletristic meaning prose fiction, poetry, and drama on the one hand, humanistic literary translation, including then this broader, what I called grey area before, including the translation of academic writing, historical texts, and so on. So I certainly work with the expanded humanistic conception of literary translation, as does the next quotation on my slide there. This is from Chantal Wright, a former alumna of BCLT, and she published a book simply called Literary Translation a couple of years ago, and in it she gives her definition of literary translation, and she says this: "My definition of a literary text is wide-ranging and encompasses fiction, poetry, children's literature, life writing, philosophical writing, and Freud's psychoanalytic writings. The quality of literariness is not dependent upon a lack of propositional or truth-bearing content." In other words, Chantal right there is stressing continuities between non-fiction translation and other kinds of literary translation. And that's probably the point that I would want to most emphasize then, that even when we're talking about translating, say, an academic essay in social studies, that doesn't mean to say that the kinds of things that we encounter when we're translating belletristic literary texts, like figurative language, are somehow absent, or rhetorical structures. Those are there in, shall we say, to use Chantal's examples, in psychoanalytic writing, in philosophical writing as well. And certainly as a translator of Nietzsche, who's a very literary philosopher, I can back that up. So are there any specific features, though, of non-fiction translation which deserve special attention, which perhaps we should be training our translators to be looking out for? Is non-fiction translation a distinct subcategory then? And I've got a couple of conflicting views on that. Here's one from one of the leading commentators on literary translation, again from a book called Literary Translation, A Practical Guide. And he says, Clifford Landers, all that has been said about translating narrative fiction applies to translating non-fiction. The same issue of the author-translator-reader relationship, the same sensitivity to nuance, the same sense of dedication. There are no uniquely non-fictional translation skills. While not every translator of non-fiction can make the switch to translation of novels and short stories, it's a safe bet that almost every translator of fiction has at some time translated non-fiction. In its way, translation of non-fiction can be viewed as a subset of translation of fiction minus some of the more vexatious elements. So kind of literary translation minus, which is not a particularly flattering view of the topic. So I thought I'd end with a different view by a translator we've worked with many times at BCLT, Katy Derbyshire, who works from German to English. And her take is this: a non-fiction translator needs to get the right register and thoroughly understand the original, has to either know about or research the field in question, and particularly its terminology, and must be familiar with the traditions and expectations around non-fiction writing in their target language. While you could say fiction translators do that too, non-fiction translators do it all to a much greater extent. And so she's making a distinction of degree rather than kind, and suggesting that there are certain competencies that non-fiction translators need to have better honed than fiction translators. And she picks out then the question of gauging the register of the original, specialist preparation, including terminology. So I think I will leave it there, and I'll stop sharing my screen. I hope that I didn't break up too much, and I'll pass back to Oliver to open up the discussion.
Thank you, Duncan. That brings us to our Q&A. We have a couple of questions, and we do encourage more from the audience. I think that the best way to move forwards with this, if anyone on the panel would like to answer the question, then please turn on your video and we'll pass rounds to you. So our first question came from Dinku Pegu, who asks a question for Joseph. Could you elaborate on the transition of a translated work into an independent text? Is Joseph with us? Yeah.
Thank you for your question. And before I deal with the question, I'd just like to say that I wanted to thank all of the other speakers. I greatly enjoyed hearing everyone's talk. It was a wonderful lunchtime. So as far as your question, once I've finished an English translation of an academic text and I go through line by line to ensure accuracy, I put the original text away and deal with my translation as an independent organism in the fact that I believe that if we're tethered until publication to a one-to-one relationship with the original text, we often end up with a substandard final product. So you're always dealing with the order of the original, the specifically Japanese phrasing of the original and the words on the page. And I think you move from just simply relocating the words on the page to English, and beyond that to actual context. And when you deal with the context, then you're globalizing, you're changing it, and you're really making it into something new. Of course, it will never be 100% your own, but you are changing it in a significant extent. And so especially in academic papers, the way and order in which arguments are developed can be quite different between Japanese and English. So a polishing and a kneading of the text as if it were bread, a kneading of the text is an important final step, in my opinion. And just to close on that, this book was put out by, it was edited by Joan Pigott. It's called Capital and Countryside in Japan, 300 to 1180. Put that up here. And they're translations of very well-known papers of Japanese ancient history and archaeology. It was published in 2006. And what I found so fascinating was they don't say translated by, they say interpreted by, because the papers are changed to a certain extent to make them accessible to an English audience. And in the end, they have translator notes, quite hefty. And I thought that use of the word interpreted was very interesting, especially when I read this when I was much younger. And that had a significant effect on the way I think about the process. So I hope that answered your question to a certain extent, but thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Do any of our other panelists want to elaborate on that? Okay. In that case, we'll move on to our next question from Naomi Hughes-White. She asks, what do you do if you find a problematic/inaccurate translation? Is it a translator's job to flag it up for revision, or is it more likely that you will read it and leave it? Any takers for that question? Duncan, would you like to share your thoughts on that?
Yes, I'm just wondering how to take the question. I suppose as a reader who is also at times a translator, at other times an editor, at other times an assessor of students' work, I'm terrible for making a note of inaccuracies in anything that I read. And it's just, in my view, a question of whether I want to bring it to the attention of the author. I will sometimes do that with any kind of academic texts when if there have been a lot of typos, for example. I haven't, I think, done that with a translated work. I think partly because, I mean, one of the things that we do within translation studies is we're questioning what a translation mistake is in any case. And when we're reading literary text, so often it's not straightforward to say, oh gosh, that's a mistake. There are some areas perhaps where that is clearer than others, but so often with literary translation, it's simply not possible to do that, or at least not helpful to do that, because one needs to bear in mind that one might not be on the same wavelength as the translator. I can see Ceci nodding there, though, and I don't know, Ceci, you want to come in there, because it is a real problem with, particularly for literary translation, because when you've got a translation of a poem, there are so many ways in which a poem can be well translated that in a sense it's not the right question to ask of the translation.
Yeah, if I may come in now, I totally agree with you, Duncan. I don't think that it is helpful to talk about errors or mistakes. Of course, there may be, a complete mistranslation of one word or, a phrase perhaps, but I'm always very careful not to talk about mistakes, but to talk about different ways of interpreting the source text. So yeah, it is perhaps not helpful to talk about mistakes as such.
It should be said, of course.
Any of our other speakers want to comment?
Sorry, I just wanted to add that clearly there are cases of basic factual errors which would always need to be corrected. We're talking perhaps about a different kind of feature which one might want to take issue with.
Thank you, Duncan. Anyone else want to? Okay, then move on to our next question from Hannah Osborne. She asks, or she says today, I particularly identify with Ceci's observations on the need to read out or enact the text one has translated. And although I agree with untranslatability, one problem I have found with Japanese of the kanji's pictographic qualities in poetry, at times there are multiple meanings conveyed through both symbol and sounds that are extremely difficult to convey in the target language all at once. So that selects the aspect of the original text which the translator most wishes to convey, and that there might be multiple ways of translating the same poem. How do our speakers deal with this particular issue of the multiplicity of the text when they are translating? Do any of our Japanese translators want to add their thoughts? Chris?
I'm happy to come in. Yeah. Perhaps it's more of a benefit for academic translation, though I'd be interested to hear from our sort of literary translation colleagues. But I feel that in an academic translation, there's more scope for elaboration, providing additional context, allowing for perhaps a Japanese term to remain in situ so long as there's an explanation afterwards. So sort of embracing that untranslatability, if you will, but also taking advantage of things like footnotes and endnotes, and even coming in with the voice of the translator and acknowledging problems in translation and providing additional context that might be too hefty and break up the flow of the main text, but acknowledging it there sort of at the end or in a footnote. So that's one benefit that I think definitely academic translation may have that literary may not, but I'm not an expert in literary translation, but maybe one of my colleagues would like to come in there.
Duncan, Ceci, would either of you, if you want to comment on that?
Yes, happy to come in there. It's true that literary translation is different in that so often a publisher will be uncomfortable with footnotes. It depends very much, though, on the kind of publisher that you're translating for. For example, I gave showed some images of Nietzsche translations that I did for Oxford University Press. That's a university press, and they were very comfortable with footnotes. And so, of course, the academic in me was delighted to be able to gloss lots of Nietzsche's terms. Of course, there's an issue there because Nietzsche actually uses a lot of languages other than German in his philosophy, and so he'll be quoting in ancient Greek or Latin or Spanish or English or French. And as a translator, then you have to deal with those as well, and at the very least probably gloss those languages for your English reader. So some presses will allow you, depending on the series you're translating for, even within literary translation, to use footnotes. I'm reminded of Clive James's fairly recent translation of Dante, of the Inferno, and he made it a point of not footnoting anything, which for a translation of Dante, which is a 14th century text, That's tough for a contemporary translator to convey everything just through the translation itself. He managed it, but then there are interesting questions about how that meant that he had to approach the translation itself, which we probably can't go into. But yes, footnotes and in general the apparatus that one can include for academic translation can be extremely helpful. And I quite take Hannah's point about the specificity of Japanese here and the question of particular question of ambiguity in Japanese.
Thank you, Duncan. We have one more question, which I think we have time for. So we have a question from Andre Pinto. How does one deal with the absence of a clear subject in Japanese, especially when translating ancient Japanese poetry like the Kokinshu? Why is it that in English translations, the majority of Japanese poems default to an I subject that is not explicitly in the original? I think this can go to our Japanese translators again. And I think that this is also a trend in academic translation as well, where it's unclear how present the writer wishes to be given the lack of subjects in Japanese.
If I could just say something, I don't know if I can give an overarching answer to this. Definitely beyond my skill set, but I remembered something I've been reading earlier today. I've been reading Anat Singh's The Mushroom at the End of the World, and there's a chapter in that deals with John Cage's translation of a classic by Basho about the Matsutake mushroom, and how he had translated it twice. The first time he was looking at a translation that had said Matsutake and on it stuck the leaf of some unknown tree, and slowly whittled down the voice, the it, to achieve just what leaf, what mushroom, which I thought was sort of an interesting way of, the way Anat Singh describes it is describing the indeterminacy of the encounter, but maybe that also encompasses something of the lack of the pronoun, personal pronoun in the poem as well. Just an example.
Thank you, Oscar. I think that's all we have time for questions today. I want to thank all our speakers who've taken the time to join us, and I'll pass over to Simon to round things up.
Thank you very much, Ollie. And I'm sorry, I realized we've got some more questions coming in. There's one from Natsue and there's one from Nadine, but I'm hoping we can find another opportunity to pick up on some of these. I'd just like to thank all of our speakers hugely for a really stimulating discussion. I think it's worked beautifully having some Japanese translation and then having our literary translators with us as well. I can't resist one of my favorite translations that I'm looking at the moment. It was Duncan mentioning Clive James, and am I assuming that that's the Clive James of TV fame that we're thinking about here, translating Dante with no footnotes? I've got it in front of me, and sorry, I don't know if our screen will allow us to see it. It's going to come and go. Anyway, this is the Kojiki, which is the first. Well, it's the first book written in Japan, I suppose. It's an account of ancient matters by one Ono Yasumaru, and it's been retranslated by Gustav Helt, published just in, let me see now, when was this? This is it's just a couple of years ago. So if I can find a date, of course it doesn't have a date on it. Yes, it does. Where are we? 2014. Okay, not quite as recent as I thought. But this has no footnotes either, explaining anything that's going on. And what he's done is it's full of wonderful, rich names. And I think it goes back to this point about what meanings do those kanji carry, the kanji ideographs carry. And he's given each one of their deities and legendary figures, and they're all given contemporary English names, which pick up on the flavor of those ideographs, rather than just giving a transliteration of what are rather bulky, unwieldy Japanese names and ancient Japanese names at that. Listen, there's so many more things that we could pick up on here. but I love the concept of untranslatability. I think that's an interesting one for us all to think about. I was particularly fascinated, as I know others were, in the use of this term intimacy, and that's something that Joseph picked up in terms of what Cecilia was saying as well. I've got reams of notes here that I'm going to go back and look at over the next couple of days and take all this into consideration. One of the reasons I'd wanted to do this session was that we have, as you've heard about, we have a number of colleagues working on translations for us in an area which can be a little bit impenetrable at times, Japanese texts about Japanese archaeology, and they're all doing an amazing job of this. We've got one of these out so far, our Archaeology of Medieval Towns in Japan and Europe, which came out just this autumn, that Oscar worked very intensely on. And we've got another couple coming out, one on archaeological heritage management in Japan that Joseph is very much involved in, and one by Professor Ono Akira in Tokyo on the use of split animal bones in the Japanese Paleolithic. And it's a philosophical comparison with European Neanderthal examples. And for my money, we couldn't have bigger challenges than trying to render these not only into English, but into English that people want to read. And I think that is the real challenge, and that we have been tremendously successful in this. And so I want to pay homage really to everybody who's involved in translation, whether literary or non-literary. And I'd like to thank all of you. I would just that is the and draw today's session to a close. That is the last of our interdisciplinary Japanese studies webinars for this semester. We will be back in the new year, but it's not actually the last of the online Japanese offerings that we have from Norwich as a whole. Next week, our very own Vice Chancellor, Professor David Richardson, is going to be appearing on the Japan Society webinar. That's next Thursday, the 10th of December, sorry, 10th of December, I believe at noon. And he's going to be talking about higher education in the UK and Japan with his counterpart, the president of Tsuda University in Tokyo. And that will be a very interesting event, I'm sure. And the following week, the following Thursday, which I think, if I look at my calendar, must be the 17th of December, we've got the chairman of the Japan Society, Bill Emmett, a very distinguished journalist in his own right who used to edit The Economist. And we're going to be in conversation with Bill, looking back over what has been a truly unforgettable, no matter how much we might want to forget it, but a truly unforgettable year, 2020, and looking at some of the Japan-related highlights and lowlights that we've all been encountering there. But I'd just like to finish off by saying thank you very much indeed once again to our speakers. Nice virtual round of applause to all of you. I'd like to wish all of you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, hopefully an easier New Year than 2020 has been in so many ways. And I would just like to say, please do all stay safe and well, I hope that whatever restrictions we're going to be enduring the festive season under are not too burdensome for any of you. So thank you very much indeed, and we look forward to seeing you all again in the new year. Thank you, and good afternoon here in the UK, and good evening to you, those of you who are in Japan. Thank you very much, and goodbye.